What happens when a major American city becomes the stage for what looks less like civil unrest and more like urban warfare? Chicago found out in shocking fashion when a vast mob stormed a downtown shopping mall, turning a bustling center of commerce into a battlefield. Windows shattered and cascades of glass cars were flipped over, and flames lit up the night sky. Eyewitnesses described the scene as a war zone in the middle of the United States, and that was no exaggeration. For hours, police were overwhelmed as looters, many linked to organized gangs and immigrant networks, emptied high-end retailers like Nordstrom in a wave of destruction that left millions of dollars in damage. This was no spontaneous outbreak of anger. Intelligence reports confirmed that encrypted messaging apps had been buzzing for days, signaling that the mall was a deliberately chosen prize. The chaos revealed just how quickly America's third largest city could be paralyzed by a coordinated assault. At the very moment local police hesitated, hampered by a controversial no-arrest policy designed to prevent escalation, gangs exploited the vacuum, moving with military-style precision. Gunfire echoed across streets, smoke billowed above downtown, and terrified families ducked for cover. The human cost was stark. Dozens of small businesses were devastated, some owners reduced to tears as they surveyed stores that had been their life's work, now reduced to rubble and ash. The attack not only gutted Chicago's commercial heart, but also struck at its identity as a proud Midwestern hub of resilience and opportunity. For many residents, it was the night that confirmed their worst fears. The city had crossed into a new era where gangs could openly challenge authority. The ripple effects extended beyond Chicago. Security analysts quickly drew comparisons to flashpoints abroad, pointing out that what America witnessed in Illinois mirrored tactics used by cartels in Latin America, where staged chaos often masked deeper criminal operations. Some even compared the coordination to hybrid warfare techniques seen in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, where disruption of civilian infrastructure is a weapon in itself. Could looting in Chicago really be part of the same global pattern, where urban instability feeds into broader geopolitical games? President Donald Trump's administration wasted no time framing the violence as a direct threat to national security. Officials in Washington underscored that leaving city streets to lawlessness would embolden not only domestic gangs but also transnational cartels, with ties stretching from Mexico to Venezuela. The symbolism was powerful. If a major U.S. metropolis could be brought to its knees in a single night, what did that signal to America's rivals in Moscow, Tehran, or Beijing? Western experts added their warnings. Former NATO strategist Michael Clark noted that organized chaos in a city like Chicago is not just a policing issue, it is a stress test of America's resilience in the eyes of the world. His words carried weight. European allies already watch with concern, as US forces remain heavily committed in Eastern Europe, bolstering Ukraine against Russian aggression, while simultaneously countering Iranian proxy attacks in the Middle East. Instability at home only adds to the impression of vulnerability. By dawn, the mall stood hollowed out its windows like gaping wounds and graffiti declaring gang dominance. The image spread rapidly across international media, a vivid reminder that America's internal fractures could be exploited at a moment when the nation faces pressure on multiple global fronts. The crucial question became clear: was this night simply another eruption of urban crime, or had Chicago exposed a far more dangerous trend that organized gangs emboldened by weak policies could act with impunity on US soil, shaking not just a city, but the strategic credibility of the West itself? What do you think? Was this chaos an isolated tragedy, or the opening salvo in a new kind of battle for America's cities? How does a nation respond when one of its largest cities seems to be slipping into chaos? In the case of Chicago, the answer came swiftly and with overwhelming force. Within hours of the looting, federal authorities launched Operation Midway Blitz, a coordinated crackdown led by Immigration and Customs Enforcement ICE, with support from the FBI and local law enforcement. The message was unmistakable: the era of hesitation was over. Downtown streets that only a night before had been filled with gunfire and looters now bristled with checkpoints, tactical teams, and armored vehicles. Entire sections of the city were sealed off. Federal agents ran identity checks, intercepted suspects, and executed raids on suspected gang safe houses. More than 550 arrests were made in the first wave alone, dwarfing any comparable operation in recent Chicago history. Suspects were charged with crimes ranging from conspiracy to loot to weapons possession to cartel-linked smuggling activities. What set Midway Blitz apart was its precision. This was not random mass policing. DHS analysts had been tracking encrypted communications in the days leading up to the assault. Phone intercepts, chat logs, and confidential informants pointed directly to ringleaders, and federal teams struck with intelligence-driven speed. Officials later confirmed that the mall chaos had been orchestrated not by chance, but by design, part of a larger financial operation to fund trafficking pipelines. The scale of the sweep drew global attention. International outlets from Reuters to BBC News compared the raids to counterinsurgency campaigns, noting the level of military-style coordination. Analysts also drew parallels to anti-cartel operations in Mexico, where federal troops have long been deployed against criminal organizations wielding firepower comparable to paramilitary forces. But Midway Blitz was not without controversy. In Franklin Park, a suburb northwest of downtown, an ICE officer fatally shot a suspect who attempted to ram his vehicle through a checkpoint. DHS defended the action as protocol, but immigrant rights groups condemned it as excessive force. Protests flared almost immediately, highlighting the deep fault lines in America's debate over enforcement. Politically, the Trump administration seized the moment. Conservative lawmakers framed the raids as overdue justice, a decisive correction after years of so-called sanctuary city policies that restricted cooperation with federal agents. What happened in Chicago proves why we need borders, why we need enforcement, and why leniency has failed, one senior administration official told reporters. Progressive leaders, however, saw the opposite proof of a broken system that conflated immigration with criminality and militarized city streets at the expense of civil rights. Strategically, the operation signaled a broader shift. Federal officials indicated that Chicago was not the end, but the beginning, with plans to expand sweeps into other cities including Boston and New York. Sources within DHS spoke openly of a target list of over 1,000 suspects nationwide tied to cartel-financed networks. For NATO allies already anxious about America's focus amid global crises, the raids underscored Washington's determination to confront threats inside its own borders, even as it faces Russian offensives in Ukraine and Chinese naval expansion in the Pacific. The optics mattered as much as the arrests. Video footage of ICE agents hauling suspects in handcuffs through downtown streets was broadcast globally. To some, it was a symbol of restored order, proving that federal authority could still bring law to America's heartland. To others, it was the image of militarization, a chilling reminder that when local policy fails, Washington will impose its will with overwhelming force. As the first wave of arrests turned into federal indictments, the stakes only grew higher. Operation Midway Blitz was not just a law enforcement action. It was a test of how far the United States was willing to go to reassert control at home, even as adversaries abroad waited to see whether America's resolve could endure on multiple fronts. The question remained, was this the turning point that would restore security in America's cities, or the opening of a new chapter where federal crackdowns become the norm in an increasingly unstable society? Could one night of looting in Chicago really expose the fingerprints of global cartels? Federal officials insist the answer is yes. As Operation Midway Blitz swept up suspects, the evidence painted a chilling picture. The violence was not simply local chaos, but a node in a transnational web of smuggling drugs and human trafficking. Among the more than 550 detainees, investigators identified individuals with direct ties to Mexico's Sinaloa cartel and Venezuelan groups such as Tren de Aragua, notorious for their operations across South America. Seized electronic devices, chat logs, and encrypted messaging records revealed that the looting had been planned in part as a diversion, a chance to generate fast money while simultaneously testing the limits of Chicago's weakened no-arrest policy. Bundles of cash, caches of firearms, and surveillance footage confirmed that this was not ordinary theft. It was a financing mechanism for broader criminal enterprises. This revelation struck a deeper nerve in Washington and abroad. Organized crime has always thrived on exploiting weak links in governance, but the brazenness of striking downtown Chicago signaled a new phase. Western intelligence analysts pointed out that such tactics resemble what is seen in fragile states' chaos in the streets designed to destabilize political order while networks profit in the shadows. If cartels can orchestrate events in Chicago, noted Dr. Ann Speckard of the International Center for the Study of Violent Extremism, then we must ask how deep their penetration into U.S. cities really goes. For NATO allies, the situation is not merely a domestic American concern. European officials worry that the same cartels moving fentanyl and cocaine into the U.S. also channel profits into destabilizing ventures abroad, from weapons procurement to partnerships with hostile regimes. Some analysts warn that cartels could act as silent force multipliers for America's adversaries. Already, there are reports of Venezuelan criminal groups cooperating with Iranian-backed networks in Latin America, linkages that extend beyond crime into geopolitics. Against this backdrop, Chicago's mall attack takes on a darker significance. It is not just a local law enforcement crisis, but a reminder of how transnational crime syndicates adapt their strategies, blending into urban unrest while funding operations that stretch across continents. The timing could not be more sensitive. Russia continues drone and missile strikes in Ukraine, while Iran escalates tensions through proxies across the Middle East. In Asia, China pushes aggressively in the South China Sea. Amid this geopolitical turbulence, the infiltration of U.S. cities by global cartels raises questions about whether internal instability could undermine America's deterrence abroad. The Trump administration has positioned the crackdown as a national security priority, not only a criminal one. Intelligence assessments leaked to Reuters indicate that cartel-linked profits from U.S. operations may run into the billions of dollars annually, much of it recycled through illicit arms purchases and money laundering networks spanning Europe and Africa. This scale of financing rivals the budgets of smaller militaries, allowing cartels to function as quasi-state actors. The implications for NATO are sobering. If adversaries perceive that America's internal security is stretched thin by cartel operations, they may judge the US less capable of sustaining simultaneous commitments, whether reinforcing Eastern Europe against Russian offensives or securing supply lines in the Indo-Pacific. Strategic credibility, in other words, is on the line not only in Kyiv or Taipei, but also in Chicago. Western experts emphasize that the fight must be intelligence-driven, not just forceful. David Kilcullen, an Australian counterinsurgency strategist, remarked that cartels today operate more like insurgent groups than gangs. They use hybrid tactics, cyber-financial, and kinetic violence to undermine states. Treating them as ordinary criminals risks underestimating the threat. His assessment aligns with growing calls in Washington to designate major cartels as terrorist organizations, a move that would fundamentally change how military and intelligence assets could be deployed against them. As more suspects faced preliminary hearings, it became evident that many were mere foot soldiers, young recruits paid in cash or narcotics to participate in the looting. Yet behind them loomed international handlers with access to weapons money and logistics networks. The challenge for US authorities was not just prosecuting hundreds of arrests, but identifying and dismantling the higher rungs of the ladder before the next crisis erupted. This raises an urgent question: was the Chicago Mall assault merely one spectacular event, or a test run for something far larger, a coordinated cartel campaign to destabilize US cities from within? When federal agents rolled through Chicago in armored vehicles, one city became two. For many downtown residents and small business owners, Operation Midway Blitz was a long-awaited show of strength. Shopkeepers interviewed on local networks broke down in tears, some praising ICE for doing what city leaders would not. In the weeks following the raids, statistics showed a 30% drop in shootings downtown, a figure seized upon by the Trump administration as proof that federal intervention worked. For these residents, the sight of suspects marched out in handcuffs was justice and long overdue. But for others, particularly immigrant communities on the city's northwest side, the sweeps brought fear, not safety. Dozens of raids were conducted near familiar gathering points like Home Depot, where day laborers often meet. Community leaders accused ICE of casting a net too wide, detaining not only cartel-linked operatives, but also individuals with minor immigration violations or no record at all. In neighborhoods already suspicious of authority, the raids deepened mistrust. Parents whispered about children too afraid to walk past checkpoints to school, fearing they could be mistaken for suspects. The political divide was immediate and intense. Conservative lawmakers praised the operation as a victory for law and order, declaring that Chicago's sanctuary city stance had created an open invitation for gangs. Progressive leaders, by contrast, condemned the sweeps as indiscriminate and heavy-handed. Cook County Board President Tony Preckwinkle released a statement vowing legal aid to families caught in the dragnet, framing the operation as federal overreach that punished entire communities for the actions of criminals. On the national stage, the raid became a flashpoint in America's bitter immigration debate. Trump administration officials insisted the looting proved the dangers of weak enforcement, linking the chaos to broader cartel pipelines. Activist groups countered that immigration status was being conflated with criminality and that vulnerable families were paying the price for a political spectacle. The clash reverberated across talk shows, rallies, and editorial pages, each side pointing to Chicago as evidence of their argument about the soul of the country. The community toll extended beyond politics. Churches and nonprofit groups rushed to provide counseling, legal guidance, and hotlines for families shaken by the raids. Civil liberties groups dispatched volunteers to record checkpoints, citing concerns about intimidation. At the same time, neighborhood watch groups began organizing in downtown districts, vowing not to rely solely on federal protection, but to prevent another looting spree themselves. The fabric of the city was fraying, pulled apart by competing perceptions of what justice looked like. Internationally, the fallout did not go unnoticed. European outlets like DW and The Guardian framed the images of ICE patrols in Chicago as evidence of America's deep social fracture, warning that instability at home could erode U.S. credibility abroad. If America's cities look like occupied zones, can Washington convincingly preach democratic values to allies and rivals? The question carried weight, particularly as NATO faces the daunting task of sustaining unity against Russian offensives in Ukraine and Iranian-backed militias testing U.S. resolve in the Middle East. Economically, the scars ran deep. Major retailers temporarily shuttered stores for security inspections, and smaller businesses struggled to reopen in the shadow of negative publicity. Economists warned of long-term reputational damage to Chicago's retail sector, with investors nervous about pouring money into a city portrayed as a war zone. Others argued the opposite, that failing to act decisively would have frightened away even more tourists and investment. For a city already losing population and tax revenue, the debate over costs versus benefits was existential. Court proceedings added fuel to the fire. Some suspects faced sentences of up to 20 years for conspiracy and weapons charges, while others struck plea deals in exchange for information. The revelations were double-edged. On one hand, they confirmed links to trafficking and cartel networks, validating ICE's intervention. On the other, they revealed that many of the participants were young, impoverished recruits, fodder for gangs exploiting desperation, not masterminds. That nuance deepened divisions. Was the government dismantling a serious threat, or simply netting the lowest rungs while leaving kingpins untouched? The city's identity itself seemed torn. Was Chicago now a model of resilience restored by federal force, or a warning sign of a democracy eroded by militarized responses? For NATO allies, the lesson was sharp. If America's domestic cohesion falters, its global commitments from Kyiv to Taipei may stand on shakier ground. The central question lingers: did Operation Midway Blitz restore order, or did it fracture trust so deeply that Chicago's long-term stability remains at risk? Can technology save a city under siege, or does it risk creating a society under surveillance? In Chicago, Operation Midway Blitz was as much a digital campaign as it was a boots-on-the-ground crackdown. Behind the armored vehicles and handcuffs stood artificial intelligence systems, biometric scanners, and an unprecedented level of interagency data sharing. The FBI deployed advanced AI to sift through thousands of hours of surveillance footage captured during the looting. High-resolution street cameras documented who entered the mall, what they carried, and where they fled. Within hours, work that once took weeks, analysts had mapped movements across the city, flagging repeat offenders and tracing escape routes. At the same time, agents scoured social media platforms, pulling down live streams and short videos from TikTok and Instagram. Many suspects had incriminated themselves by bragging online about stolen goods, leaving digital fingerprints as damning as DNA. ICE checkpoints across downtown introduced another layer: portable biometric scanners capable of verifying identities in seconds through fingerprints and facial recognition. According to Department of Homeland Security officials, these tools were crucial in separating innocent bystanders from high-value cartel operatives. Dozens of fugitives with outstanding warrants were flagged almost instantly. Proof supporters argued of the efficiency of modern law enforcement. Yet for every supporter, there was a critic. Civil liberties groups warned that Chicago was becoming a testing ground for surveillance without oversight. The American Civil Liberties Union raised alarms that biometric checkpoints risk sweeping up innocents, disproportionately targeting immigrant communities, and normalizing constant monitoring. International observers echoed the concern. The Guardian compared images of federal agents scanning faces on Chicago's streets to scenes more familiar in authoritarian regimes than Western democracies. The debate is not merely philosophical, it is strategic. If America projects an image of a nation where internal order can only be maintained through mass surveillance, NATO allies wonder whether the US is drifting toward securitization at the expense of liberty. At a time when Washington criticizes Beijing's use of state surveillance against its citizens, images from Chicago threaten to weaken that moral authority. But technology undeniably changed the battlefield. Experts like Dr. John Spencer of the Modern War Institute emphasize that urban warfare is no longer just fought with rifles. It's fought with sensors, cameras, and algorithms. He noted that the integration of AI surveillance with human intelligence mirrored techniques used in modern conflicts, from Ukraine's use of drones and data analytics against Russia to Israel's deployment of cyber intelligence in its standoff with Iran. In this light, Chicago was not an anomaly, but part of a global shift, the fusion of civilian policing and military-grade intelligence. Meanwhile, gangs were adapting too. Reports revealed that the looting had been coordinated largely through encrypted apps, private chat servers, and even online gaming platforms to mask communication. This cat-and-mouse game of technology meant law enforcement was never far ahead for long. Security specialists warned that as governments sharpen AI and biometrics, criminals will find new ways to exploit the digital space, forcing a permanent cycle of escalation. Still, the numbers told a compelling story. Federal officials reported that more than $15 million in stolen goods, cash, and weapons were recovered thanks to intelligence-driven raids. By their count, dozens of cartel-linked operatives were identified and networks disrupted. For the Trump administration, these figures became the cornerstone of the argument that high-tech enforcement not only works, but is necessary in an age where crime syndicates operate like insurgencies. Yet the haunting question remained: how much freedom are Americans willing to trade for safety? If biometric checkpoints and algorithm-driven arrests become normalized, does the US edge closer to the very systems it criticizes abroad? And if gangs can adapt as quickly as governments, is this technological arms race winnable, or will it only erode public trust further? Did Chicago's night of chaos mark only a local tragedy, or has it opened a window into America's future? The aftermath of Operation Midway Blitz suggests the latter. What began with shattered glass and flames in a mall has rippled outward into a national test of how the United States balances liberty, order, and strategic credibility in a turbulent world. The hard numbers are stark. More than 550 arrests, millions in damages, and a reported 30% decline in shootings downtown in the weeks following the raids. Federal officials hailed these as proof of success. For many residents, the restored sense of safety was undeniable, yet the human and political costs remained equally significant. Immigrant families, traumatized communities divided, and civil liberties advocates warning that America was sliding into militarization. The Trump administration has leaned heavily on the symbolism. By framing the crackdown as a victory for law and order, officials sought to project not only domestic strength, but also international resilience. If we cannot secure our streets, how do we expect to deter Moscow, Tehran, or Beijing? Asked one senior national security advisor during a briefing. The logic resonated. Adversaries look for weakness, and domestic disorder can be as damaging to credibility as battlefield losses abroad. NATO allies are watching closely. With Russia intensifying its drone and missile strikes in Ukraine, European capitals depend on Washington's resolve. At the same time, US forces are stretched to deter China in the South China Sea and counter Iranian proxies targeting Western interests in the Middle East. Against this global backdrop, Chicago became more than a local policing story. It became a stress test of America's ability to manage threats at home while sustaining commitments abroad. If domestic instability deepens, allies fear America's strategic bandwidth could fracture. Experts are divided. Some, like retired U.S. General David Petraeus, argue that strong federal intervention was essential. Restoring order quickly in Chicago was not just about crime control, it was about signaling to allies and adversaries that the U.S. can still act decisively under pressure. Others warn that the method's heavy surveillance, biometric checkpoints, and aggressive raids risk alienating communities and undermining the very democratic values that NATO claims to defend. The deeper concern is whether cartels and criminal networks are probing US vulnerabilities in ways that mirror hybrid warfare tactics. Just as Russia uses disinformation and cyber attacks to destabilize Europe, cartels may be weaponizing urban unrest to weaken US cohesion. If this interpretation proves correct, the Chicago Mall assault was not just crime, it was part of a broader contest where America's adversaries exploit every fracture in its social fabric. For ordinary Chicagoans, the questions are immediate and personal. Parents wonder whether their children can safely walk to school. Business owners debate whether reopening downtown is worth the risk. Community leaders wrestle with whether cooperation with law enforcement has become too dangerous. On the ground, the struggle is about survival. In Washington and Brussels, it is about strategy. Chicago has become both a symbol and a warning, a symbol of what decisive federal power can achieve, but also a warning of what it costs in trust, unity, and freedom. As Operation Midway Blitz expands to other sanctuary cities, the stakes grow higher. Will America emerge stronger or more fractured? And so the nation stands at a crossroads. Did the crackdown save Chicago, or did it reveal a deeper collapse? Was this a demonstration of strength that bolstered U.S. credibility abroad, or the first step toward an era where liberty at home is eroded in the name of security? The answers will not be found in one-night statistics. They will unfold in every courtroom, every neighborhood checkpoint, and every foreign capital measuring America's resilience. What do you think, was ICE right to intervene with overwhelming force? Or has America sacrificed too much in the pursuit of order? The looting of a Chicago mall in 2025 spiraled far beyond a local crime story. It became the spark for Operation Midway Blitz, one of the most sweeping federal crackdowns in years, with over 550 arrests and intelligence confirming ties to Mexican and Venezuelan cartels. The Trump administration framed the raids as a triumph of law and order, proof that federal resolve could restore security where local policies had failed. Yet the operation also exposed deep divisions, immigrant communities fearful of raids, civil liberties, advocates warning of surveillance overreach, and political leaders locked in ideological battle. Internationally, Chicago's turmoil resonated as a test of American resilience. NATO allies already reliant on Washington's leadership in Ukraine, and the Pacific watched closely to see whether internal instability might weaken U.S. deterrence. Experts compared cartel tactics to hybrid warfare, suggesting that America's adversaries could exploit urban unrest as a weapon. In the end, Chicago became both symbol and warning. Decisive federal action can restore order, but at the price of trust and freedom. The nation must now answer a fundamental question: how much liberty is it willing to trade for security in an era of global uncertainty?